And right now in the world, we have about 68 million people who are displaced, either across the border because of violence as a refugee, or internally because of violence or some other set of causes internally. And when we talk about this issue, this phenomena of forced migration, we tend to think about Syria, we think about Afghanistan, we think about Sudan, we think about countries across Asia and Africa, and periodically countries in Latin America like Colombia and Central America. Very rarely does Brazil figure in this discussion. And what was striking for the Igarapé Institute when we started to look at this phenomena in Brazil was that it was actually much larger than many people imagined. This is an invisible crisis that has not really received the kinds of attention in Brazil that other types of phenomena have achieved. And so a lot of the concern in Brazil has been about the population of Venezuelans and Colombians who've come into the country because of conflicts in Colombia or because of political and economic crisis in Venezuela. And it's true, there are tens of thousands of Venezuelans and Colombians seeking refuge and asylum in Brazil. But very rarely do we talk about Brazilians who've been displaced internally, either because of natural disasters like floods and cyclones, or because of development projects like hydroelectric dams or mines, or because of violence, because of interfactional violence within gangs or militia or otherwise. And when we started to, tighten the lens and focus in on this phenomena, we found that there are more than 7.7 million Brazilians who've been displaced internally since 2000. And yet, nowhere was this being discussed in the national media. We tended to see little types of conversations focusing on refugees, or focusing maybe on some populations who've been displaced in the Serra, or maybe a few people who've been displaced by hydroelectric dams like from Belo Monte. But never we looked at the global entirety. And for Igarapé Institute, it was really important, if we were going to have a serious policy conversation, to actually get the data on this phenomena right. We often don't have policy when there's no evident problem around which to form policy. There's an expression of see no, hear no, and as a result, we'll see kind of a policy vacuum when it comes to these kinds of phenomena. I think for a long time in Brazil, in a way, so long as this problem was far from view, it was confined to the countryside, to the Amazon, or to the coast areas where basically the centers of power weren't based, it was fine for policymakers in the private sector to, in a way, ignore the issue, to, in effect, not really acknowledge that it exists at all. And so in the absence of this information, in the absence, I would say, of an organized, coherent campaign and pressure from populations who are affected, but also populations who are sympathetic to these situations, in a way, there wasn't the kind of pressure on policymakers to take action. The other big challenge, I think, is because the issue is dispersed. We have people who are displaced from development, people who are displaced from natural disasters, and people who are displaced from violence. You have very different epistemic communities, very different types of legal centers of expertise, very different types of, let's say, quality of information and specialists working on the issues who didn't necessarily talk to one another. And so one of the big challenges, I think, for governments is to develop a kind of all of government, a whole of government approach that brings together specialists in protecting people's rights, together with those who are responsible for providing services, together with those who are charged with providing some form of restitution and financial compensation, together with those that provide all the other ranges of activities that are needed. Instead, what we get are very uncoordinated, scattered, sort of divided responsibilities. And so what Brazil lacks right now is a centralized authority that actually looks and understands this challenge, that coordinates across different secretaries, ministries, and departments to be able to provide the kinds of needs that these populations require, but also that's able to create a communication channel with populations to be able to adjust the response and prevent future displacement before it actually occurs. And this is not just unique to Brazil. I think if you were to go to India, or if you go to perhaps parts of Central Asia or parts of Africa and other parts of Latin America, you'd see a similarly discoordinated, uncoordinated response. But it's important to stress that there are some internal factors also that resist responding to this population. Why? When you're displaced as a result of a dam, or you're displaced as a result of a natural disaster or violence, the state, in a way, is responsible for providing a basic provision of services and needs and goods to you as a citizen. If you don't exist, if you're not recorded, if you're not documented, it's hard for the state to have to respond. So in some cases, there's almost an internal bureaucratic resistance to developing a more coordinated response, and that has to change. It's really interesting. I mean, Brazil often, I'm a newcomer to Brazil, and what I've been struck by is that most of my Brazilian colleagues have often felt that Brazil didn't have a big problem with natural disasters. If you ask Brazilians, they say we don't have a lot of earthquakes, we don't actually have a lot of floods. They're certainly aware of how cities were often concentrating risks in terms of climate-related risks. But generally, Brazilians have thought that theirs was not a country that was deeply affected by natural disasters. What was striking when we started this process of collecting hard data on people who've been displaced by natural disasters, development projects, and violence was just the sheer proportion and the scale of people who've been displaced from natural disasters, especially flash floods, but also the drying up of certain areas, droughts, as well as sort of rising sea levels in particular coastal areas, and mudslides and a whole manner of issues. And fortunately, Brazilian government keeps reasonably good records on the populations who are displaced temporarily, because it often provides relief assistance to these population groups. Unfortunately, it doesn't keep a long-term track of these population groups. So after 6 months or a year and a half, we don't actually know what happens to this population, this category of population. Often we'll see people, because especially the poor and the vulnerable, who are forced into areas of high vulnerability and exposure to natural disasters, being displaced multiple times. So this is a whole category which was extraordinary. As you said, roughly 70 to 80% of the entire caseload that we found were people who'd been displaced by natural disaster. The next largest group of population were people who've been displaced by development projects, by hydroelectric dams, which are the most famous. There's over 80 large hydroelectric dams in Brazil, but also from mining projects, from road building schemes, from urban renewal projects, from even building mega projects through the Olympics and the World Cup and other mega events. And roughly 1.5, 1.6 million people have been displaced from development. And that was striking. The area where we had the least amount of information was really violence-induced displacement. And this is, from IGACP's perspective, one of the most interesting areas, but it's the hardest area to get good data on. We have virtually no information on the people who are displaced from cities. And if you consider that roughly 85 to 90% of Brazilians are living right now in an urban setting, this is a huge lacuna. In the literature on disasters, often you'll talk about an instantaneous disaster result of a cataclysmic event, an earthquake or a sudden flash flood or a massive tidal wave from a tsunami. These kinds of events, while they are in a way predictable because we're able to look at seismic activity and predict the movement of different atmospheric pressure zones and understand the risks of certain areas, those are really tough often to prevent, and you need to have safeguards in place in high-risk areas or vulnerable areas where that's going to occur. The problem is that often the most vulnerable people to these kinds of disasters are often the poorest people in a society. They're the ones who have the least access to resources. They're the ones who are forced into the most acutely chronically risk-prone areas, in particular cities or on shorelines. In any case, it is possible to prevent those exposure to displacement if you're able to put in the safeguards in advance and the disaster risk mitigation measures in advance to limit the possibility of people being flooded or people hit by a tidal wave or people hit by an earthquake. And that means having early warning systems in place. It means having data-driven alert systems in place that allow people sufficient time to be able to flee before an event occurs. It means having zoning restrictions so that you don't build in areas that are going to be particularly exposed to a high-risk sudden onset event. It means having communication networks with other partners, both in Brazil and across Brazil, so that you have the data in the right place to be able to anticipate what's going to happen. It means educating your population and visiting schools and visiting community centers and ensuring that the population understands how to respond in the event of a disaster. In the next sort of 30, 40 years, we're going to see more than 1.5 billion people on the move because of climate stress. This is not just in Brazil. Our problem as human beings is that we often can't think ahead. We don't think, it's the burning frogs and the boiling frog syndrome. We struggle to be able to see incremental changes in our environment, and therefore we don't make adaptations to our behavior and our planning now when we should be. We have the data right now. We have the information to be able to make the smart choices. The question is, do our policymakers and our corporate leaders have the wisdom to be able to develop the right planning strategies to mitigate the exposure of people now, rather than wait until the last minute? Well, the good news is that there already are some examples of model legislation that are emerging around the world to address the rights and needs of individual citizens who've been displaced as a result of disasters or development, and to less extent violence. In the case of development, the World Bank and different regional banks have actually developed a set of standards that address sort of key risk factors that citizens and individuals face when they're displaced, that provide for legal guarantees, that provide for compensation at a market or above market rates, that provide certain forms of services and goods for a certain period of time for people to allow them to get back on their feet after they've been displaced. And so I think within these model guidelines that have been developed by banks and others, and some countries, for example, Canada, even the United States and parts of Europe, I think there are great examples that Brazil could draw from. In the case of violence-induced displacement, it's a little more complicated because often the actor who's responsible for inducing the displacement isn't necessarily known. They're often illegal. And so developing standards beyond the standard human rights provisions that ought to apply are a little more difficult. The good news is that there are what are called the internally displaced person guiding principles, which were an interagency process set up by the United Nations, designed specifically to set out the appropriate laws and legislations and provisions in laws to safeguard the rights, the protection in particular, but also the care and management of these populations, and to allow states to codify these into their existing national legislation. The best experiences we have right now are probably from places like Colombia, parts of the Balkans, for example, that have experienced conflicts. India has also been experimenting with all sorts of novel methods. China as well, although has a very different kind of government, so the extent to which lessons can be transferable are more limited. But I think the first point that all of these countries that have dealt with large-scale displacement have is having early warning detection. Having a system in place, a system of data collection, often administered by government in partnership with the private sector and or civil society and academia, that centralizes data and that provides a kind of more real-time access to information so that the public and the public sector in particular has a better understanding of what's going on. Without data, you're flying blind. The second, I think, factor is setting up a ministry or a department in a way responsible for these kinds of issues. Of course, it's impossible to centralize all the requirements of dealing for these populations, both before they're displaced and after. But having some kind of entity, an institution that aggregates responsibilities, that codifies the laws, that sets out standards and principles, that provides training to the state and the city level actors who are really dealing with these issues on the front line is critical. I think the third factor is the role of cities. Cities here, but also around the world increasingly, are the front line for populations who are displaced. And so there are networks of cities around the world that are actually out there providing support to frontline cities to be able to learn the right approaches to deal with these populations in terms of integration, in terms of providing the basic services like health, education, documentation, protection, legal services, and the whole panoply of activities. So if you went to, for example, Athens, or if you went to Cologne, or if you went to Oslo or Malmo or Stockholm or to even some of the cities in the US, the so-called sanctuary cities in the United States, you'll have a huge reservoir of experience from those cities on how they dealt with populations, for better and for worse, how they were challenged. One of the biggest challenges for resettlement projects is the fact that the people who are often the most likely to be resettled are often the poorest, the most vulnerable in a community. They're also the ones who are least likely to have access to land title. in other words, a deed or some kind of formal legal recognition of their property. This is incredibly difficult because from the perspective of a government or a private sector actor who's undertaking this displacement, or in the case of natural disaster and violence, if you can't produce a deed, then the government may just expropriate your land and provide you nothing in return. What happens is people are relocated from an area where they may have a strong social network, where they may have connections of livelihood and commercial relationships, and they're often moved to marginal land, often far away from where they were, often not connected through highways or transportation corridors or market networks to where they were. They're often not given a lot of choice in where they go. You know, in any resettlement process, there'll be some winners and losers. But the challenge that we've seen over the last 20, 30 years, including here in Brazil, is the vast majority of people who are resettled are losers in the process. A very small number actually do better out of it. And so the question is, how do we ensure that we maximize the benefits for people who are moving? How do we minimize the displacement projects or the displacement events to reduce the number of people who are displaced? Rather than investing in big mega schemes, can we think about smaller, more distributed schemes that have less of an impact on individuals and the environment? And how do we create the restitution and compensation that's fair, that ensures that at a minimum, people are not moving from poverty into more poverty, that people's lives are improved in the process?